This week, we're also talking about something that all of us can do as well that has huge impact, but it is a little bit scary because we're talking about how you and I have the opportunity to share with our other people, to share our faith or wherever we're at on our journey in a way that can influence the journey of other people. That we can help other people know how they might even have a relationship with God that can change their life forever. And maybe God would use you and me to help in that process as we share our story. And that sounds great, except it's also a little scary. Because what we're talking about today, another word for it, just to raise the scary level, is a word, a churchy word, evangelism. Evangelism. Isn't that a scary word? You know, I did some research this week to find out what are the, not necessarily scariest, but the most cringe-producing words in the English language. Here they are. Ooze, mucus, cyst, isn't this great? Bulbous, pus, moist, congeal, fester, smear, fungus, pulp. I'll add mayonnaise, it's kind of the same thing. But not good, right? You think, but if nobody thought about the word evangelism when they were asked those questions, but my guess is if they had, you might put that word in there, because when we think about evangelism, all kinds of things come to mind maybe that is not so great, because it's one of those words that gets kind of ruined, and I get that. And on the positive side, my granddad was a pastor for many years in Kentucky, Nazarene pastor. And before that, though, his job title was evangelist. Like that was his job, evangelist. And he would go around the different parts of the country. This was in the 1930s. And they have these tents and they would, go and do these meetings. In fact, here's a flyer from that survived. That's my granddad from the 1930s. And I love that little phrase, one man evangelistic party, because he did it all. He did the music, he did the thing. But if you knew my granddad, he was a one man evangelistic party. That's a perfect expression for him, because for one thing, he was a big, charming, happy, funny, always had jokes, personality. And so he was a party on the way to happen, but he also had a huge heart to help other people come to know God and have a relationship with him. And so he had a way, because he was so charming and he was so funny, that he could do that in a way that if I did the same thing, people would be offended. But he could turn every conversation into a conversation about Jesus in a way that people were glad that's what was happening. And I love that. And he's in heaven. My granddad's been in heaven a long time, and there's a whole lot of people with him in heaven because of him, in part, which is a cool thought. But all that said, even though I'd love to be influential like that, I'd love people to be in heaven too because of me, that'd be great. But still, that evangelism thing, it's pretty scary. Like his title was evangelist, his job title. Imagine being on an airplane, being on a flight, and you're seated next to somebody you don't know, and you're getting to know each other, and you ask them, hey, what do you do for a living? And if they said evangelist, I bet maybe you'd be like me, I'd want to change seats. I'd be like, because, you think about these people that manipulate people or fleece people out of money or pushy or just talk about God, even if people don't want to hear it, they just keep pushing through it because you should want to hear it and all this stuff. But I want to rescue the concept and bring it into something wherever you're at on your journey, whether you believe you know God right now or not, you're on a journey, that we can influence the journey of other people in a positive way. And because evangelism as a concept, even though it's been ruined in a lot of ways, it's actually a beautiful thought. Evangelism, in fact, comes from it's a Bible word. The word, it comes from a Greek word, the New Testament written in Greek, evangelizo. You see the Greek on the bottom. And this is one of those words, like when we talked about baptism a few weeks ago, that they just took the Greek letters and made them put with English equivalents and made up a word. So evangelism is just a made up word. So that's why it's a church word. But 2,000 years ago, it meant something. It was used in wider culture all the time. It wasn't just a church word. It wasn't just to talk about God. It was a word, all it means is to share good news. So like we're entering into the Christmas season, and you may know the story when the angels show up and they say, we bring you good news of great joy. That phrase, we bring you good news, is saying we're evangelizing you. We're sharing good news with you. And think about that. We all want to hear good news, right? I mean, it's a loving thing to share good news. Like if you were looking for a job and somebody knew about a job that could be yours, it was a great job and would be perfect for you, you'd want them to share that good news. Or if you were sick and there was a cure, you would want somebody to share, yes, there's a cure. You don't have to deal with this. Like, here it is. If there was a financial problem and there was a way to ease that, you'd want to hear that good news. If there was an opportunity that would be incredible for your kids or your family or for you, you'd be like, thank you. And you and I, if we know about what Jesus has done, that's the best news in the world. It doesn't get better than that. That God is real and he doesn't hate us. He loves us. He's not apathetic. He's interested. In fact, he came for us. That we believe that Jesus is God who came here, took on human flesh to live among us, to connect with us. Not only that, he dies on the cross to take away the penalty for sin that you and I deserve so that we can be forgiven. He offers that freely. He rose from the dead. He's alive today, wants to come into our life, begin to change us and grow us and use to change this world. You and I can know God and be his children and be with him forever, but also know him now and be changed now. And that's pretty good news. There's not better news than that. And I think all of us would say, yeah, I would, if we believe that, certainly we'd say, yeah, I'd love to be able to share that in a way that other people could, grab onto it and see it as the opportunity for what it is. And yet at the same time, it is scary because what if I do it wrong? Or, in a world that's so sensitive to talk about politics this week or religion anytime or whatever, like what if I push people away more than help them? And what do you say? It's just easier not to say anything. And what I want to do is to give us is to equip all of us to be able to share about God in a way that can be helpful. And even if you're not a Christian right now, you have a story and you're on a journey that can be helpful for other people. So how do we share that in a way that's not counterproductive, but it's productive and take away the fear factor a little bit? And the good news in the Bible is that it talks about this really directly. So there's a guy named Peter. He was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He becomes, when Jesus is raises from the dead and ascends to heaven and the church starts, he's one of the key leaders of the early church. And he writes 2 books in the New Testament, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, to people who become Christians in the Roman Empire. And as a Christian in the Roman Empire, Christianity was brand new. Nobody had heard about Christianity and God is the way we think of God and Jesus and all of it. And not only was it foreign to people, for these new Christians to be able to share with others, it was also maligned a lot. There was a lot of slander about Christians because in part the leadership of Rome did not like Christianity because they didn't worship the Roman emperor and things like that. So there are all kinds of smear campaigns and misinformation campaigns that are going around. And so these Christians had a lot against them trying to just share about Jesus and share their faith in a skeptical culture, which is helpful because 2,000 years later, guess what? We live in a skeptical culture when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to religion. So how do we share about that in a way that is helpful? And what Peter tells these Christians is so helpful. In fact, it's 2 verses, but one thought in 1 Peter that we're gonna look at. And if this is all we do, you and I will have a huge ripple effect. You and I will have a huge impact. And so let's look at it. Here's the verse in 1 Peter chapter 3. Peter says this, and if someone asks about your hope as a believer, and he's talking about living, in the context of the passage, he's talking about living around people who don't believe and living lives that are attractive and that are loving and that stand out in a good way. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, Always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. Hugely helpful, and I want us to unpack it. Two big thoughts here. One is to how we live in a way that creates curiosity, that creates pull is another way to say that. To create pull, to live a compelling and connected life in a way that causes people to wonder what makes us us. Cause people to be open to what we might have to say about God. Maybe even open enough that they would ask. It's to create a sense of pull. Now, if you are around this church very long, you'll hear us talk about creating pull rather than being pushy, or being pulley rather than being pushy. Because a lot of times when people think about sharing our thoughts about God or religion or anything else, it's people get pushy, right? And we push our views on other people, or Christians do that. And that's not biblical at all. The Bible talks a lot about how we should engage in a way that is not that, but instead to create pull, meaning to live in a way that actually creates credibility, that makes people want to know what makes us us, wants to be curious about us, maybe even enough, like in this passage, where they ask for the hope that we have. Like, why are you that way? Why the love? Why the hope? Why the faith in a world like this? And we can share it, but at least be open. And if you think about it, in a world like this, where there's not much hope, and for Christians, if we have hope in something bigger, well, why are you okay? Like, even when we go through difficult things, like, how are you making it? Like, how are you okay? Or love is another one. Like, if we love the way Jesus loved, that's what Jesus said, this is the way people know you're my followers, and be compelled if you love the way I've loved you. And if we love people in a self-focused world that way, if we're that forgiving, that generous, that other-focused, we will stand out. And it will cause people to be open and to wonder, man, what's the deal with you? Like, think about it this way. Somewhere along your journey, your faith journey, I know that God has used one or two or a few people in your life that just sort of stand out. These were people that maybe they're the ones who invited you to somewhere like this or something, or they shared their story in a way that was compelling to you. I want you to think about one person who was influential in your spiritual journey that you respected, just the way they loved, the way they lived. Can you think about one person? Because I do this from time to time. In a little bit, we're gonna say their name out loud, just their first name, and to think about the ripple effect they had. So, you got your person in your mind? Yeah? Up there, you got it? All right, so on the count of three, I just want you to say their first name out loud, okay? 1, 2, 3. Isn't that cool to think about that? Because most of them have no idea that just happened. They were just living their life, doing their thing. But and imagine, if I do this 5 years from now, imagine if there's people who say your name because of the way God has used you. And that's the power of what we're talking about. The power of being able to share in our story, but live a compelling life in a way that makes people curious. And part of that is not only being compelling, but also connected. I mean, the reason that we said their name, the reason those people were impactful in our life is they were a friend. Or they related to us, they invited us, they engaged us. They didn't just get busy with their religious people, but they hung out with people like us. And that's always something we have to keep in mind, because it is so easy once we become a Christian to just start hanging out with Christians and sort of lose touch with people outside of our faith, and we can't let that happen. Because God has put us where he's put us in part to be a light to people and to share our story, and to make sure that we make a priority, not just hanging out with each other, but those maybe who are outside, who don't know God yet. So that's the first part, is to live a compelling and connected life to create pull. And when we do that, we also need, as Peter says, to be prepared to share our story in a helpful way. To be prepared, that's what he says, be prepared, be ready to share the reason for the hope that you have. Be ready to share. That yes, be a good person and a loving person that creates pull, but also it's not about just being a nice person. Also be ready, be prepared to share about Jesus with other people in a way that they can understand it's good news that is for them. So be prepared. Paul says to the Roman Christians, he says, but how can they, those who don't know God, how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they've never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? At some point, right, somebody told us, at some point, we have to be ready to share and to tell people. And I think, though, that can be so scary that we psych ourselves out thinking, I'm not gonna do that because nobody wants to hear it, right? And I'm just gonna mess it up, and I don't wanna do that because people, they don't want to talk about this kind of stuff. And I don't think that's true. So there's been a bunch of research done all the time. There's so much research done in our culture. And I do a Rebranding Christianity podcast. And on that podcast, a few weeks, couple months ago, had the opportunity to interview a guy who's a researcher and an author. He wrote a book called The Great De-Churching. Michael Graham was the person that I talked to. And it's a fascinating book to read. And The Great De-Churching is, on the surface, bad news for sure. It's really the story and research behind it of how over the last decades, 40 million people who were associated with Christianity have left Christianity. So 40 million Americans, that's a lot. So what's going on there? And that's what the research is. They found a lot of fascinating things. I encourage you to read. One is the least likely group of people to have de-churched are highly educated people, which is interesting. But just listen to the podcast. But 40 million people. So you think about that, okay, 40 million people now, they don't want to hear anything about God. They want me to invite them to anything. They're out, and because these are people who were Christians who are now out, like I'm done. But what they found is it's actually not true. So for 10 million of the 40 million, that is true. 10 million of the 40 million really right now are not that open. It's like, I've been there, done that with Christianity. I don't want to hear about it, I'm done. 10 million are in that category. But 30 million are not in that category at all. 30 million said that, yeah, if they're not jaded, they're not actually that negative, they just sort of drifted out of Christianity. And what they said is, if somebody that I respect invited me, I would say, yeah. That they're not actually that jaded, that negative, whatever. They're actually somewhat even positive, but they're just sort of out of it. And if somebody that they respect would invite them or talk to them or whatever, they'd be all over that. 30 million's a lot. That's almost 10% of our population. And so let's not be so quick to assume people don't want to hear about anything or us to invite them to anything. Same way we talk about the younger generation and how they don't want anything to do with Christianity. And that's actually not so true either as much as we think. Yes, when you look at young millennials and older Gen Z, reputation of Christianity not so great. That's the whole rebranding Christianity thing. And we could do better and all that to win people over with what Jesus really is. But it's actually encouraging, latest research. Because the youngest Gen Z, Barna did this research, which is teenagers and college students, that age right now, of 50% of those who said, I'm not a Christian, 50% said, but I'm very curious to know more about Jesus. And they said, I would love when they look to, well, what sources would you look to them it makes sense, well, Christians. I'm really open to what Christians believe about Jesus because they're the ones who know about it. I want to know about Jesus. They're the ones who know. And yeah, I would love to know more about Jesus. That's a lot of people. And all I'm saying is we have no idea even what God is doing, creating interest and all that. He's the one that's at work. Our job is just to be faithful, to invite and to love and to be able to share our story and not assume, oh no, people are just like, blah, 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 blah. Let's not assume that. Let's be sensitive, and when we pick that up, we kind of back up, but not assume it before we get started, and be ready to share our story. And the reason I keep saying share our story is he says be ready to share the reason for the hope that you have, which is very personal. That's your story. But I also think that's the best way to talk about how somebody can come to know God through faith in Jesus and the difference God can make is to encapsulate it in our story. I mean, there's other ways you can do it. You can memorize a presentation of about Jesus, and that's not bad. I mean, but I think by itself, it's maybe not the most impactful. It's not the most effective. I mean, it is good to know, just sort of like one of the ways I'll summarize what we call the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is do versus done. That Christianity is not religion. Religion is what we do to earn God's favor. But Christianity is about what Jesus has already done for us. It's about his grace. He offers everything freely. We don't do anything because we can't. And he offers everything freely, his forgiveness, his presence, all of it. And so it's helpful to kind of know how to be able to talk about that. But in our culture, the power of being able to just encapsulate the good news about Jesus in our story is that it's not offensive. Because you're not saying, well, I'm right and you're wrong. I'm the expert, you're the dummy. It's just, hey, here's what's going on in my life. This is what God's doing in my life. Man, I didn't know God, and now I do. And before that, this is what it was like, and now it's so different, and and that's just our story. And then we can be sensitive. I mean, we should be sensitive enough and respectful enough to also be interested in their story as well, because everybody's got a story. And I want us to be able to do exactly what Peter says, to be able and ready to share our story. That's one of my goals for this year, is for every single Chase Oker. And even if you say, well, I'm not a Christian yet, for every single Chase Oker to be able to share our story in a way that could be helpful in the story of other people, to be able to share our faith. And so to do that, I'm gonna invite someone to come up. His name is Ray. And Ray, come on up. Let's welcome Ray, because it's not, to come up to the stage. Because when I thought of somebody, man, what Chase Oker could really help the rest of us be able to be prepared to share our story with other people in a way that can be helpful, because I think all of us would love to be able to do that. And so I asked Ray, not only be here, but also, hey, prepare something that we all on our own time, on demand, something that we could go through to be able to craft our story and share our story in a way that could be helpful. And you obliged and said yes, and I really appreciate that. But Ray, you didn't start out as a person who knew Jesus and wanted to help other people know Jesus. So share a little bit of your story.
Okay, yes. So I did not become a Christ follower till I was 27 years old. So yeah, I didn't have much of a church background either. So as I was growing up, church, I was kind of stiff-armed to it. And so I became the party guy. So from a very early age, 15 till I was 27. And so now I was always curious about church and faith and Jesus and all that, but I had two big objections, and I didn't know anybody that could answer them. And so my objections were, I had a bunch of questions as to whether or not we could really believe this stuff, and so that was part of it. And the other one, my only experience with church was that it was incredibly boring. And so it didn't seem relevant to me. So I continued with the party stuff, and then in the last 2 years of that, it just wasn't fun anymore. And so I partied harder trying to recapture the fun, but it just didn't work. And so I had a lot of questions I needed answered. So I went to a guy that I knew named Kip, and he was actually the first guy that I ever partied with. But he'd become a pastor, of all things.
Ruins everything, yeah.
Yeah. But he's a good friend of mine, so we had that trust. So I was able to ask him all the questions, like how can we believe the Bible's not been changed? And Jesus, how do we know that he really lived? And can we believe by facts that he came back from the dead? All that stuff. And so he answered every one of my questions. I was shocked. And so I still had other questions, but I was satisfied. The other one was about the church being boring. Well, around the same time, another guy invited me to his church, and I'm like, yeah, I'll go. And it was nothing like I experienced growing up. So both of my objections were taken care of, and I felt like I was face to face with Jesus, because like, what's your excuse now?
Yeah.
And so I decided for the next almost a year to just run away and party even harder. And turns out the more you run from God, the more you run right into him. And so I become a Christ follower when I show up that day, still feeling the effects of the night before. And so it was shocking. Now, being that I didn't have a church background, when it came to I didn't know about baptism and serving and giving and all that. And so when it came to even sharing my story, evangelism, to go back to old Randy Jackson and American Idol early days, that's a no for me, dog. No way that I was gonna do that.
So that was a hurdle. But you got over it. I know it's something you're passionate about, is sharing your story, helping others do that in a way that can be influential, and we can help other people, know what Jesus has done. So how did you get over that, or tell us about that?
Right. So it's funny because one of the things the Lord is called is the God of all comfort. But when you're not following him, he can sure make you feel uncomfortable, right? And so that was me. Now, as I grew in my understanding and I grew in my faith, well, it became clear that this sharing my story is supposed to be part of my life. Like, it's all through the scriptures. It's easy to find. But then even just logic, I'm a logic person, so even just logically. So the way I think about it, like, have you ever seen The Three Amigos, the movie?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's one of the best movies of all time. Like, when it came out, it should have won every major award, including best cinematography, and I don't even know what that is. But I've told quite a few people that I like that movie. And my point is that we share the things that matter to us, whether it's our favorite hamburger, our favorite movie, favorite song, whatever. And so for me, what he had done in my life was so drastic and so shocking, like nobody saw it coming, least of all me, that I became increasingly uncomfortable not sharing my story.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us are in that mode. So help us, what would you say that could help us if we're a little resonant to share a story or not quite prepared, or to share our faith? Help us get, what do we do? How can we do that?
Well, some things I found helpful. Well, first of all, you get better with practice. I go back to when I first started, and it was terrifying for all the reasons that we could easily list, right? And so for me, there's a few things. Now we'll show you in a second, we have a tool that we developed. But before we get to that, there are a few things I found really helpful. The first thing was to put it down on paper, put your story on paper, and as you wrestle with that and navigate, there's three major components. What your life was like before you became a Christ follower, how you first understood and then became a Christ follower, and then what your life been like since. And so once you get it down on paper, then you're ready. You're ready, you can share it in a moment's notice, and you can share it in relationship over time, let your story leak out a little bit, but you're ready. And so that was one thing. Another is, you talk about the importance of relationship. Mm-hmm. And so, because it's more like art than math, sharing your faith. If it's like math, at least the old math the math today, I have no idea what, I stopped helping my kids when they're like in 4th grade. So I am not smarter than a 5th grader, literally. And so more like, because math is you do this, you get this result, but that's not how it works sharing our faith. It's more nuanced than that, right? Because it involves relationship, it involves backstory, it involves circumstance, emotions, and so much more, because what I'm gonna share with you is not what I'm gonna share with somebody else. And so when we have that relationship, we cater how we share our faith to that relationship. And to me, again, that's one of the most helpful things we can do. All right, so now you get those two and you put those together, and then a whole lot more helpful tools. And then what we find is the tool that we developed. And you're gonna see a QR code, you can scan it and be able to access this. Now, for me, when I became a Christ follower, I was really by myself and I did not have a lot of help. And so I'm really thankful for God's grace during that time. Now, we don't want anybody here, though, to feel alone in this. And so the idea is that for every person that follows Jesus, we really were meant to live a great story. And so we put together this tool, and it involves storytelling and some short videos, and then a way that you can put your story on paper to where you can really capture it, gain confidence in it, and share it. And you can do this individually, but you can also do it with your small groups. In fact, small groups, whether you're doing sermon-based studies or not, we would love for you to jump in on this, because even week 1, it's only 5-minute video. And then during the week, members of the group would walk through it on their own and then come back and just spend a few minutes, each share their story, and it'll be inspiring. I guarantee it. But once you go through this process, I believe you'll be more confident in being able to share your story.
And I'm gonna just ask all of us, let's please go ahead and put the QR code back up there. Please capture that and go through it, because we have the best news ever to share, and just to be ready, when somebody is open in a conversation or somebody even asks. is all that God's asking us to do. He's the one that's creating interest all around us, and it's the best news in the world. I mean, I'm about to go to Egypt and India. I leave today for a mission trip, and there's no Chick-fil-A in Cairo. But if I found out when I left that there was, and somebody knew it and didn't tell me, I mean, come on, you know? And of course, that's more significant. So any other thought? This is something you think about a lot. Any other kind of parting thoughts for us?
Just a few. If I could go back to myself, like if the Lord said, I want you to go back and talk to you the moment you became a Christ follower, because again, I'm still feeling the haze from the night before, about what we're talking about, I would say what the Lord just did in your life, because it was striking. He wants to do in a whole lot of other people's lives through your story. But you're gonna have to share it. And you're not gonna want to at first, and that's understandable. But as you navigate it and learn how to do it, you're gonna do it, and it's gonna lead to some of the most drastic, incredible, life-changing, impactful stories that you'll ever experience in your entire life. That's what I would tell me. Now, what I would say to all of us, you could probably relate to me in my feeling that I can look at my life and see how I've missed so many opportunities. I don't want to miss any more. And living into, trusting and following Jesus into the story that he's written for us, that's the great story. Mm-hmm. Trusting and following Jesus into the story he has for us, and then sharing it is a great way to invest our life, because life is just too short to miss it while we live it. And for me, what the Lord can do, I went from someone who had no desire to share my faith to someone who now serves as part of a church where this is a primary focus.
And when he says serves as part of our church, I didn't say this. He's our campus pastor at the Woodbridge campus, so shout out to Woodbridge. But Ray is one of our pastors on staff, does an incredible job. And Ray, thank you. Thanks so much, and for doing the tool. Man, I really appreciate you. So let's be prepared. Let's be ready. Let's live lives that create thirst. And the way, I love what Peter says too, because this is often missed. And that is, when we do all this, to do it in a gentle and respectful way, that how we engage people about our faith is at least as important as what we say, is how we say it and how we engage. And he says, therefore, do it in a gentle and respectful way. Now, respect, I think we can get. Respect means that we're not condescending. We're respectful. We understand they have a story too, and we listen. It's not a monologue. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. The word gentle, I'll bring that out. This is the Greek geek in me, but in studying New Testament, but I think it's really helpful. So in the New Testament written in Greek, translated into English, and the word translated gentle is a very unique word. It's only used 4 times in the New Testament, 2 times to describe how Jesus related to people who didn't know God. And then 2 times Peter uses it to help Christians understand how they can relate to people who don't know God. And therefore, it's the concept we're talking about. So gentle, it's one of those big words that's hard to translate because it just is what linguists call a fat word. And so, because there's a lot of meaning, so gentle is part of it, but it's more than that. It really means not pushy. Whatever, that pushy, arrogant, whatever that is that all of us react to, it's the opposite of that. It's humble. It's open, it's teachable, because all we are is learners. The word disciple, we're called disciples in the Bible. That's another word for learner. We're just a learner among learners. We're on a journey and they're on a journey, and so we're not some expert. God's the expert. Like we know our story, and we're learning and we're growing, and we're as helpful as we can be with other people, but let's do that in a gentle, humble, respectful way. And think about the opportunity you and I have. One of my favorite phrases in the Bible, I'll kind of end with, and that is in Acts 17, where Paul is talking. He's at Mars Hill in Athens, and talking to these philosophers who've never heard about Jesus, never heard about God in any biblical sense of that concept. And he's having this incredible conversation. And part of that, he says this in Acts 17:27, God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. And that's the phrase, he's not far from any one of us. Because God is not playing hide and seek. God wants to connect with those who are not connected. And what he's telling people there in Athens 2,000 years ago is, you don't realize this, but God is everywhere. He's all around you. He is closer than close. He's just right there, ready for you to connect with him, because that's his heart. And one of the more profound ways that God is close to people in a way they don't know it is, guess what? You. God has put you there. In your family, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your school, on your team, in part because he wants to connect with people right around you. And you know, you've got a story, you know about Jesus, it's all right there. And he wants to use you and me to live lives that are compelling as we love people and just live authentic lives. And then be ready to share our story, to extend the invitation or to have the conversation or to share that, because on the other side of that is God. And wouldn't it be cool? You know, I think about my granddad who's in heaven with all these people who are in heaven in part because of him. And I love thinking about those conversations about, dude, you don't even know me, but you helped me come to know God. And wouldn't it be cool, right, to experience that same thing? And God wants to use you and me to be influential in the story and the lives of others. So let's pray and ask that he would help us do that. Father, thank you for how you have used people in our lives. And would you help us to be that helpful in the lives of others? God, would you help us do exactly what you say in this world, to just be able to share about you? Understanding your heart is to connect, and so much so that you've placed us where you've placed us. And it's easier just to act like that's not true, but don't let us do that. Help us be willing to be your people, to live the lives that you're calling us to live, and be ready and able to share our story and extend invitation and all of it. Use us in this world. In Jesus' name, amen.